Welcome to the lecture for Crisis Intervention. We'll be talking about cultural considerations when doing crisis intervention work. Let's start off just talking about why we're talking about this, right? So why is it important to be a culturally effective helper, culturally effective interventionist? Why is cultural competence important? One, it's hard to deny that we live in a pluralistic world, right? There are all kinds of people in this world, and all of them have the potential to experience crisis. Very few of them will be just like you. Right? Probably nobody will be just like you. So if people are different than you, then it's important to be aware of some of the ways they might be different than you. And that's a lot of what cultural competence is about. Related to that, cultural competence is important for valid assessment. If you fail to take into account cultural differences, it's possible that the information you gather about a client will be inaccurate. Right? You might misperceive or mislabel something as a sign of pathology when the opposite is true. Or you might also say, "Oh, that's normal, that's typical," but it's not typical for given some other cultural variables, given their cultural context, right? So maybe a client is venting emotions fluidly, and you think, oh, well, this is appropriate, this is good, they're getting it out, this is a helpful reaction to the crisis. But it might be that for that particular person, that this is an indicator of severe psychological disruption and the potential and it's not just regular venting for them. This is really something serious, and you're misreading it. Right, and that might be true if most of the people who are culturally similar to that person, wouldn't act that way. But if you don't, if you aren't attending the cultural variables, you wouldn't catch that. You'd be like, oh, that's typical. And again, the opposite might happen too, where you think, wow, that's really pathological. They're not talking at all about this, but that may be typical for them culturally. Or if a client, upon first meeting you, gives you a hug. Right? You might think, oh, wow, this person might be histrionic, maybe borderline, something's going on here. Maybe not. Part of that determination should include some assessment of the cultural context. What does the hug mean for them? Especially if it doesn't mean the same thing for you, given your cultural background. It's important for valid assessment. It's also obviously important for effective intervention. The techniques or skills that you employ might be perceived differently by different cultural groups. And this could impact the efficacy of what you do. Example might be asking direct questions might be off-putting. It might be perceived as intrusive and pushy by some people, if it's kind of violating a cultural norm. But by the same token, failing to ask direct questions might indicate to that person a lack of caring, and that you're kind of cold and distant. Right? And that may be tied to some sort of shared cultural belief system. And then also, it's important for determining appropriate intervention goals. Right? Sometimes a treatment approach may work, in terms of maybe we can get the client to achieve some goal or goals that we think are important. Maybe symptom reduction. But again, if we're not attending to cultural variables, we may neglect goals that are culturally relevant. So maybe we reduced a client's symptoms of anxiety, but part of what they also wanted help with was to regain their status within some social hierarchy, and we didn't even think about that being important because of cultural differences. Okay. And finally, cultural variables might also be part of the causative chain leading to a crisis. Sometimes really straightforward, like ethnic violence in Serbia. And as with most situations, knowing something about the cause is typically helpful in figuring out how to help. So being culturally competent is important for any type of intervention service, any type of therapy, particularly so for crisis intervention. And part of that is because with crisis intervention, we often feel a lot more rushed, and we don't feel like we have time to do a lot of cultural assessment, and you certainly don't have as much time. But that doesn't make it any less important, and the stakes are even higher with the decisions you're making. If you disregard some cultural rules, or you flub something up because of a cultural misunderstanding, and you fail to establish a therapeutic relationship, now the person, if they're in crisis, there's kind of higher risk. Even worse things may happen than if it's some sort of long-term therapy where they'll just not show up next time and then they'll go see a different therapist. Right? May not be that opportunity with crisis intervention. So the stakes are a bit higher, so you have a little bit less time, but more pressure to get this right. So what does it mean to be a culturally competent interventionist, culturally competent therapist? A couple things, and this is from Kaselica, identified 4 key attributes: self-knowledge, knowledge about other cultures, culturally relevant skills, and cross-cultural experiences. So we'll talk about each of these 4. Okay. Starting with self-knowledge. It's important to be aware of your own assumptions, biases, and values that may not be shared by other individuals. And these are typically things about, what the world is like. I assume that if someone asks me about my religion or spirituality, that they're being a little intrusive, and they're probably trying to convert me to whatever their belief system is, right? And that's an assumption I make. It's one of my assumptions about how the world is and how people typically are. If I were living in many Eastern countries, India, for example, I probably wouldn't have thought that if I'd grown up with that kind of cultural background. I would think, this is a typical way. Instead of asking what you do for a living, which is kind of what we do here in the States, a more common question would be, how do you worship? What temple do you go to? Also, our biases, thinking about what the world should be like. For me, I know that, I believe in more egalitarian sex roles, men and women sharing in responsibilities and duties in a family system. And that's how I think the world should be. It's a bias. It's a preference. That's how I think the world is. That's how I want it to be. And not everybody shares that bias, And bias always sounds like such a bad word. It's not. It's just what you want. It's a preference, an opinion, an attitude, if you will. And some attitudes are bad. Some are good. We're not going to get that here. But it's how we all have ways that we want the world to be, think the world should be. And not everybody shares those ideas with us. And then last, in terms of values, thinking about what's important. And usually this is about, there's usually some commonality for value. Like, if you think about all the things that are important, if we made you come up with a list of 100 things that are important, your list is probably similar to most of the people's, in terms of the, at least 50 of those 100. But the order of the values is really where we get those differences. So for me, I value education over wealth. So, I'll push my kids to do well in school, just to learn more than pushing them to acquire job relevant skills to increase their earning potential. Right? And that's part of my value system, which is different from other people's value systems. Right? So I'm aware of some of my assumptions, biases, and values, but probably not all of them. But of the ones I am aware of, to be a culturally competent counselor, should I eliminate them? Am I supposed to eliminate my assumptions, suppress my biases, and ignore my values to be a good therapist? I don't think so. I think what's important here is I need to understand that the way I see and think about the world might be different in meaningful ways from those I work with, right? I therefore need to be sensitive for when these differences can impact the work, right? And not all differences are relevant or impactful for intervention. My preference for peanut butter, onion, and mustard sandwiches, probably not shared by a lot of people, not really relevant to the work, right? So there's some cultural differences in kind of food preferences, certain attitudes that don't matter. And there's some things that may be relevant in long-term therapy, but they wouldn't be relevant in a crisis situation. Some things will be, some things won't. And that's where part of the skill comes in, is figuring out when those things might be important, and just being open to the fact that there might be differences. Okay. And there also may be some instances where you have a culturally relevant value or bias that doesn't allow you to be accepting of a client's behavior or attitude. Right? For example, if a client feels that it's okay to use physical intimidation in romantic relationships, in a marital relationship, that may not be okay with you. You may not be able to say, oh, well, that's just a cultural difference. I'm okay with it. And that may be something that just, for you, you're not going to be able to accept that as, well, that's just how they are, and it's just a difference. It's a difference that you'll feel is wrong. And when those things happen, when you bump into those differences that you can't be accepting of, that you can't just accept as a difference and try to work with it, you've got to figure out what your legal and ethical obligations are. And in my opinion, you need to be honest with the client about those differences, and honest, and be part of being genuine, telling them, whenever you talk about doing this, I feel this, and you own that, and you have to figure out if you can't help the client because of the conflict, then you're probably going to have to refer them out. But just because there's a conflict, you won't necessarily have to refer them, right? You might be able to talk with the client and kind of negotiate some sort of compromise, some sort of understanding that allows you to work on the client's goals and getting them to where they need to be without compromising your own values. So you're not going to necessarily impose your values on them, but you're not going to have to compromise yours either. But if you figure out, well, I can't work with them without compromising my values, then it's time to refer. Okay. Last point about this: it's unlikely that you'll ever be fully aware of all your biases, just because so much of what we do and think goes on at a level of automaticity that we don't and possibly can't attend to. And you can call it automaticity, you can call it unconscious, but a lot of times we don't know why we do what we do, and we're just not aware of it. So unless you're going to spend half your day meditating on your actions, you're probably not going to find all your biases. But you need to be on the lookout for them and be sensitive to the fact that there are probably some there, and that they're probably acting and playing a role in your therapeutic relationships. Okay. Another aspect of self-knowledge that doesn't get talked about too much is self-presentation. How you come across to others. And some of this is obviously related to what the others, what the clients bring to the table in terms of perceiving you, but not all of it. Think about the different judgments clients may make about you. They have their own assumptions, biases, and values. And so it's certainly quite possible that something about the way you talk, the way you dress, your skin color, your height, your age, is going to play into some stereotype they have that's culturally relevant, and they're going to have some expectations from you that may or may not be accurate, right? So it's not just us misunderstanding clients. Clients might also misunderstand us. And you can't predict all of those, but that is one component of self-knowledge that you can try to work on, is how do people see you, and how might they misunderstand you? Okay. Which brings me to your first discussion question. In the text, they talk about the 10 common biases relevant to crisis intervention, and I'd like you to read through those 10. We've already read them, but read through them again and try to think about an instance where one of those has been true for you, where you've kind of say, oh yeah, I did that. I've had that bias, and I'm aware of it. Okay. So write about that. Tell me about that, some example of when that's happened, preferably with a client. If not a client, in any other kind of instance will suffice as well. Okay. Now I'd like to do one more thing before we move on to self-knowledge. If you could grab some scratch paper or something, and a pen, or open up a little Word document beside this movie on your computer, I want you to write a few things down. And what I want you to do is imagine that you're working with a client who is culturally different from you. Okay. And you can only ask them 3 questions to find out all you need to know about their culture, all the culturally relevant information. You can only ask 3 questions, and they all have to be closed-ended questions, right? So no cheating, like, tell me about your culture, right? So 3 closed-ended questions, that's all you get to learn as much as you can about this person's culture. What would those questions be? So if you need to pause it here to write that down, those 3 questions, closed-ended, to figure out about this client's culture. Okay. Now, assume you've unpaused. Now I'm going to want you to write down 3 more questions. But this time, imagine that your client and your therapist is culturally different from you. And you need to let your therapist know all the culturally relevant information about you in order to help you with some problem. What 3 questions should that therapist ask you? And again, same limitations. They have to be closed-ended questions. What would those 3 questions be that the therapist would ask you to find out about your culture? Okay, so pause it here if you want to jot those down. Okay, assuming you've done that and unpaused. Now, you don't have to write anything more down, but now I just want you to kind of look at those 2 sets of questions and think about, well, first say, are they the same or are they different? And if they're different, why might that be? How are they different? And what do you think contributed to the difference in your sets of questions? Okay. Okay, moving on to knowledge of others. The first thing I want to talk about is having a universal a universal view or a focused view. Right? So a focused view, talking about diversity issues and multicultural issues, looks at cultural differences and similarities in terms of visible and racial or ethnic minorities. Right? It's kind of this group versus that group. Right? Whereas a universal view looks at all the possible ways that a client can be different from you, from the therapist, right? So, if your client went to Colleen High School or St. Joseph's High School, right? So universal view is typically more informative than a focused view. Obviously, a focused view is easier to think about because it's a lot like stereotypes, and stereotypes make the world easier to think about. Well, if all these people belonging in this category are this way, that's easier to think about than thinking about all the different ways an individual could be different or similar to you, which is trickier, but much richer and usually more helpful information to use that universal viewpoint. So, related to that, getting on to talking about stereotypes. Because related to the focused view is the tendency of whenever you're reading about multiculturalism, even in psychology and counseling courses, is for the authors to simultaneously disdain and promote stereotypes. Right? So we're cautioned against applying cultural stereotypes, and then frequently we're taught new ones. Right? So, for example, that Native Americans prefer not to engage in direct eye contact, and so you shouldn't misinterpret that as a sign of resistance or disrespect. Right? That is a stereotype. Now, it may or may not be true for a majority of people who identify themselves as Native Americans. Whether or not it's true for a majority of them or all of them doesn't make it any less of a stereotype. And the problem with stereotypes, or one of the problems, is that they're frequently wrong. And the validity of some of the stereotypes that we've been taught over the years and we've been teaching over the years have been called into question by newer research, right? So often what we're told about some particular minority group is offered with minimal empirical support to validate it. It's usually some member of that group who identifies as a member of a group saying, oh, we are like this. And, nobody appointed that person as the spokesperson for that group. And it may be true for them and many people they know, but it may not be true for everybody in that group. Right? And like I said, some of the truths about minority groups have not been supported by cross-cultural research, and that some have more support than others. But no point getting into all the different patterns findings here. Just know that be wary when you read about if this group of people are like this. Filipino Americans are like this. Well, some of them maybe, but not all of them. Right? And especially in the field of crisis intervention, there's just been very little cross-cultural research done looking at how these different groups, if we were to look at them that way, might respond differently in crisis situations. There's lots written about it, but not much data. Right? Now, this is not to say that the stuff you read about minority groups having, certain characteristics or tendencies is all crap. No, I'm not saying that. It may be true for a majority of the minority, but just not necessarily true for everyone. So knowing about these things, reading about, okay, well, this group might do this. What it does is it helps you form hypotheses about the client's behavior that might not have otherwise occurred to you. Right? If you read, this group prefers not to have direct eye contact. That will, even if you forget what group it was, you'll keep in mind that, okay, sometimes within a cultural group, eye contact has different meanings. So when a client's not looking at me, part of it may be a cultural difference. Part of it may be they're pissed off at me. Right? But it kind of introduces these more hypotheses that you may not think about. If a client shows up late frequently to appointments, it could be resistance. It could be related to a culturally different understanding of time and timeliness. Okay? So again, it's just all about promoting in your mind more hypotheses, more things to think about. Okay, so the same things we talked about before with knowledge of yourself applies to knowledge of others. All the assumptions and biases and values of the individual, right? So again, it's best to take this kind of idiographic approach, understanding that here is an individual who is probably a member of multiple cultural groups, depending on how we define cultural groups, multiple overlapping cultural groups. What is this person like? What are their assumptions, their biases, and their values? Okay. In addition to that, it's sometimes helpful to consider and read about the research and the theory about different cultural dimensions, which is different ways of thinking about how certain cultural groups or cultural practices are similar or different to each other. And talk about two dimensions that are talked about a lot. One being looking at individualistic versus collectivistic cultures. In individualistic cultures, traditionally thought to be individual focused, right, where the person is the center of the worldview. When I look at the world, I am a person in the world, and I'm wondering where my place is. Right? In a more collectivistic culture, it's about collectivistic worldview, seeing about not necessarily where I fit in the world, but I'm a member of this group, and maybe where does this group fit in the world, right? So we're thinking about achievements, either what have I done versus what have we done. Okay, but again, some of the newer research, even looking at this cultural dimension, has suggested that some of the things we thought we knew about the relationship between geography and this cultural dimension, not that accurate. We kind of thought, it's a traditional Eastern-Western split. Western very individualistic, Eastern very collectivistic. Not necessarily. You have to look more closely, and you'll see a more complex pattern. Moreover, some of the things that we've assumed about what it means to be individualistic and what it means to be collectivistic haven't been fully supported. Okay. That being said, for your second discussion question, I'd like for you to think about, after reading about individualistic and collectivistic cultures, think about what worldview best typifies how you see the world. Which one do you identify with more? Okay, so tell me which one, and then identify two reasons for your choice. What makes you think that you have an individualistic worldview? What makes you think you have a collectivistic worldview? Okay, and yes, you have to put yourself in one of those camps. You can't say that you're in the middle. Okay. The second cultural dimension I want to talk about was high versus low context cultures. Whereas the first dimension was about worldview, high versus low context is largely about communication within a cultural group. High context cultures tend to be characterized by a strong in-group affiliation. So we're all alike in many ways. We're us, and then there are these outsiders. And within the in-group, when the members communicate, there's a whole lot of cultural context to the communication, and because of all the cultural context, you don't need a whole lot of verbal interchanges. The way things are said, when they're said, who's saying them, communicates lots of information. But again, it only makes sense to people who are in that in-group, right, who are part of the high context culture. Versus a low context culture, they're typically more diverse groups. And so there's less of this kind of shared in-group identification, and so there's less impact of kind of shared cultural context on communication, and so there is necessarily more verbal interchanges when trying to communicate information. Okay. And so as long as you're if you're high in a high context culture, as long as you're communicating with somebody else who's in the same in-group in that high context culture, no problems understanding each other. Low context culture, same thing. Talking to somebody else with a low context culture, use lots of words. You can make yourself understood. The difficulties come when we have somebody from a high context culture and a low context culture trying to interact. And then there might be a mismatch of how things are being communicated, where the person from the high context culture may think that the person in the low context culture is speaking way too much and overdoing it, and they must think I'm really stupid to talk this much. And the person from the low context culture might think, wow, this person's really reticent, they're not saying anything, I don't know what they're trying to tell me, I don't understand how they're feeling, because they're not saying enough, right? Okay, and then the last piece about knowledge of others is ecological context, right? Because culture, also we talked about thus far, is about shared knowledge and beliefs, right? And ecological context is pretty much everything else about individual differences that are important. So in terms of this person's access to resources, the political structure of whatever government they're living under. Excuse me. What community agencies and community leaders are active and relevant to them. These are all part of things that are relevant to their ecological context. It's kind of the background, the setting that they're placed in, beyond their kind of cultural identity and beliefs. And people have different ecological contexts, and part of this may overlap some with class, obviously. Okay, now moving on to culturally relevant skills. The first one is really a basic therapy skill. It's empathy, right? And empathy is both a skill and an attitude, right? It's about the ability to try and see the world as the client sees it, and to communicate that you're doing this, right? It does a lot more good if you don't keep it a secret that you're being empathic, right? If you're being sneakily empathic, you may have a good understanding of the client, but they're not going to feel it. So you need to communicate your efforts that you're trying to understand their worldview and their assumptions about how the world is and how the world should be. Okay. In addition, to be culturally competent helps to have multiple intervention skills, right? Because not every approach will work equally well with every person, especially given that some types of approaches will work less well with people that have certain cultural differences, right? Especially in terms of some techniques require a high degree of verbal fluency, in the same language as the therapist, right? And if the other person doesn't speak the same language you do equally well, or you have different communication styles, then really kind of verbal-based therapies, a lot of the cognitive therapies, may not be that helpful, right? So you may need to learn some more nonverbal techniques, more hands-on techniques. it's in addition to having lots of therapeutic arrows in your quiver, you also need to possess the flexibility to use them, right? You don't just have this, here's my go-to approach. I'm really good at this. I'm really good at this thing. Well, this thing might not work with this individual, especially if there's some cultural variable that makes that approach ineffective. So you have to be flexible and have the wisdom to know, okay, this isn't working. I need to try something else. And again, I think largely with experience comes the idea of not just, let me try the next thing. I'm best at this. My second best thing is this. And that's probably what you'll do at first. My A game didn't work. I'll go to my B game. But with more experience and wisdom, you'll not necessarily go from A game to B game, but okay, you probably still start with your A game. If that doesn't work, then you'll think, okay, why didn't that work? Which of the techniques that I know is most likely to work based on what I know about this client now and why this first thing didn't work, right? And that's where a truly eclectic approach comes in, where you're systematic and not just randomly drawing at straws. Okay. Also, we have social work here, right? Having the ability to help clients locate and utilize local resources, which is kind of what social workers excel at. One of the things they excel at is important in general for crisis intervention, but it's especially important when working with members of a minority population who may traditionally experience disproportionate obstacles to accessing services in time of need, which is something we know from some of the research that's been done on the ground, that certain groups that are more empowered, they do a better job of getting resources because they're very verbal, vocal, active. They may be well organized, and other groups that are maybe more disenfranchised, more separated from a larger group, might have a harder time getting those resources that the government's trying to provide to people. But there's a gap, and you may have to be part of your job is being able to help them bridge that gap. And if you can't do it, part of your job will be being a good collaborator to bring in somebody like a social worker who can help bridge that gap. And then last, humility. You've got to have the humility to acknowledge to yourself and often to the client that you don't know everything you need to know about them or their culture, right? And be confident enough in yourself to let them be the expert in their culture and be willing to listen and learn from them, right? Again, while not forgetting your professional training and obligations, you're still the expert therapist, but they're the expert on themselves, and especially when you're more out of your depth, with somebody who's more different from you in your experiences, you really have to share more of the load there and let them teach you about what they need, rather than assuming that you know, right? Okay. And then the fourth thing we talked about in terms of being a culturally competent interventionist would be cross-cultural experiences, which it can sometimes be difficult to seek out cross-cultural experiences. One thing that may be helpful when you're doing any kind of practicum or internships is to tell your supervisor that you want one of the points of emphasis of your training to be cultural competency, right? Encourage them to challenge you to think about the culturally relevant variables at play in your work. And this will help you make the most of whatever diverse experiences you're able to have. Okay. Outside of actually being able to do the work in your training and while you're being supervised, not as good, but still worthwhile would be exploring the media that's out there. This is really the easiest way to get some exposure to other cultures through audio and visual media, films. And I'd say typically stay away from the big studio films, because they more often than not will perpetuate stereotypes rather than show you anything new about a cultural group. So look for those independent films, but even when you do that, don't assume that whatever film you're watching is the truth about a group. But it might be truth about some people who are members of a group, and it might be a truth that you haven't seen before, weren't aware of. It might bring up issues that you previously just hadn't thought about. And then, again, that's what learning's all about, and that's what being a culturally competent therapist is about, is seeking out those experiences to broaden your horizons, because the broader your horizons are, the easier it is to be sensitive to those differences that might impact the work. Obviously, talk to friends and family about their experiences and their belief in your own culture, in their culture, in where the differences are, where the similarities are. There may be people in your own family who have significant cultural differences from you, which is hard for some people to believe, but it's true because, again, culture at some level is very individualized. Okay. And then last, with the advances of technology, now we have these online social networks that provide opportunities to learn about and from a wide group of people with diverse experiences. Many people are now giving you a window into their world, posting pictures and information about themselves. So, take a look. If you're on the Facebook or whatever, look around and see what people's lives are like in different parts of the country, different parts of the world, if they're, if you have access to those individuals. Okay, so those are the four things. So summing up, in terms of defining culture, it's not as simple as ethnicity or geography, right? It's much more this kind of universal view. It's all about different individual differences, where a client is maybe different from you, okay, and where you may be different from them. Okay? And understanding those differences, being sensitive to those differences, will make your work more effective. Right? You'll do a better job of helping people if you can be sensitive to differences, rather than trying to squeeze people onto a certain set of boxes. Related to that, attitude is as important as knowledge, maybe more important than knowledge, right? Being open to differences and making the effort to understand where someone comes from is more important than memorizing, which ethnic groups you should shake hands with and which ones you should hug, right? It's important to read that stuff and think about, people have differences in personal space, differences in eye contact, differences in how many words they typically say in a conversation. It's important to be aware of those differences, but don't worry about trying to figure out, okay, it's this group does this group does that. Just be aware there are differences out there. Be open to them, right? And not that, okay, some people do stuff wrong, right? That's not being open to it. Some people do things differently. And then, you can figure out for your own self what differences you agree with, which ones you may disagree with. The important thing is to be open to these differences. Lastly, don't forget your discussion questions, 2 of them for this time. One was about an instance of bias, those 10 examples, or 10 types of biases. And the other was about individualistic versus collectivistic culture worldview, which one you identify with more. Okay, that's all for now. Take care.